welcome back to Overhaul Overland. We've just finished our in-depth test drive with Alaric to really establish the health of the drivetrain. We know there are going to be some issues we're going to look at when the gearbox and the drivetrain get stripped. And we also, in episode 2 with Snyman 4x4, when we did the test on the engine and we did a full compression test, it wasn't consistent through the cylinders. There were varying degrees of pressure in the different cylinders, which spells a problem in the engine. We need to go and check further and do more investigations into this. So it's difficult to test an engine under load, and the only way we can really do it properly and record the data is to put it on a dyno. And that's why Deon and Mark are going to help us look at the power output of this vehicle on the dyno, look to see where we're losing power and how much power we're losing, so that we can make a better informed decision on our repairs. Deon, it's great to have our vehicle on the dyno before we actually buy it. Now, I want to explain to people, what's the value of bringing the vehicle and putting it on the dyno?
Well, if I take this specific project that we're going to be doing for you, is rebuilding the engine and lots of other additional stuff, we want to make sure that everything electronically controlling the engine is in a good condition. And all the safety parameters are working, instead of just going in, building the engine, putting it in, and then we've got to look for electronic problems afterwards and cause a little bit of problems down the line for us. Just to make sure the car is qualified in a very, very good condition, things around it, ECUs working properly, basically all the safety parameters. And obviously to look at the power, where the power is. That's the most interesting thing. We don't want to rebuild the engine, put it back in, and we decide, hold on, we've a lot of power down there because we've got parameters we haven't looked at yet.
Well, what we actually do is beside all the checks that we do, live data that we check on the computer itself, is actually to see if the vehicle is within specification. Obviously, when a vehicle is manufactured, it comes out with specification, then the power and the torque that on certain RPMs where it needs to be. So what we do is we monitor and we run it and we give it a power run to see if that is close to the specification, if there's any smoking from the exhaust, if there's power losses when running the engine. I mean, something can be fine when it's cold, but when it's on temperature, a cracked head can be there, and that you only most probably find when it's on running temperature. And that all is stuff that we can pick up once we run on the dyno and loading it and actually watching the physical live data while we're doing it. Most important thing on a diesel motor is, well, it's called a CI engine because it's compressed injection. And with that, we look at the air-fuel ratios. Now, the air-fuel ratios is air versus fuel in the motor itself. So it's completely different to a petrol combustion engine where you actually want more fuel to make it safer, which we call richer. And on a diesel vehicle, we actually want it leaner because a leaner air-to-fuel ratio drops the EGTs. Now, EGT is exhaust gas temperature. Now, the richer a diesel vehicle runs or motor runs, the higher the EGTs is. And when the EGTs gets out of a certain range, well, firstly, you'll see it start smoking, and secondly, it's very, very damaging for the diesel engine itself, because when the EGTs is hot and running hot, that means your combustion temperature is much higher than the exhaust gas temperature, and then you can start burning, melting pistons, damaging internals, crack head cylinders. So that's a very, very important fundamental when getting to tuning and obviously looking at issues when it comes to a diesel engine itself.
A lot of people don't know to have their diesel injectors tested every 80 to 100,000 kilometers, and that's where you see your biggest failures on diesel engines, is when people just carry on riding and riding and riding. And if you buy a new car, get to 80,000 km, you carry on riding, and now at 110, 20, you want to wonder, why is my car giving problems? Because the injector, once it gets worn, actually supplies too much fuel to the engine, and that's what kills it. It causes the exhaust gas temperatures to go much higher, and that's when you pick up real big problems. So that's Mark can pick that up. He'll explain to you a little bit more about how they do look at the air fuel ratios and stuff like that. It's a very, very key sign that we'll probably test now. If the air fuel ratios are out, that's going to tell him, okay, look, we've got to go and look at pump and injectors, and it's part of rebuilding the engine, but you want an idea how bad they are.
Okay, Mark, so we've got the motor now. You want to do some basic physical checks on the motor. Do you want to start with the cooling system and just talk us through it?
Yeah, so first thing is is to check the coolant level. So obviously we will remove the radiator cap, and while
it's cool, hey?
Yeah, obviously make sure it's cool and there's no pressure in the system. And then obviously first thing, while you've got the cap off, you can actually have a look at the seals inside the cap. And this is also a good indication if there's any pressure in the system, you'll actually pick it up on the seal. It will start making marks and you'll actually see the seal pushing away.
Pushing past.
Yeah, it'll actually push out. So that's also a very good indication to see if anything is happening internally with the water system itself. Just check if there is any coolant in the radiator itself. Once that is on level, it's always good to see on the overflow bottle and have a look if there's water in there as well. Because this cap has a pressure setting on it, 0.9 bar. Right. And when the pressure in the water system exceeds that pressure on the cap, it actually pushes this part open and it will push water into the overflow bottle, which is also not a good indication because then there's something wrong in the coolant system as well. Yeah. So based on that...
It's replacing the water back in the radiator.
Exactly. Yeah, it's actually pushing it all out. And to a certain extent, you'll obviously have no water left in your coolant system, and that'll overheat the engine and cause obviously extreme damages as well.
So Mark, let's check the oil, because that's going to, as you said, tell us a story.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing on this dipstick here?
Well, let me just quickly get some on my finger. Okay, so firstly, this oil is pitch black. Which is already a good indication that it's very carboned up and the oil has got a lot of soot in it as well. Now this could be caused, well, you can actually feel the lubrication is also not what it must be. So this is a good indication that there's a possible, I won't say a problem, but there's an upcoming problem. It can be low compression, and when the compression on a diesel engine is low, it doesn't burn all the diesel fuel that's been sprayed into it by the injector, and that actually goes through into the oil, and it actually contaminates the oil up to a point where it actually goes pitch black, a lot of soot build up, and there's actually no lubrication, and that can obviously cause engine internal damage as well.
So I've also found problems in the past where you've gone and picked up bad fuel that hasn't been properly refined. And by doing your daily checks, you know you've got a good engine, but looking at the oil, you find that it starts getting the same sort of effect. It's getting gloopy and it's getting thick with soot hanging in it, and you can see it. Diesel oil will always go from a clear to a black because of the unburnt fuel to any engine. But this is excessive.
Yeah,
and we're finding when you start the car, it's hard to start, and there's a bunch of smoke going out after we started it,
yes,
which is telling us that the unburnt fuel going into the oil.
Correct.
Okay, so that's a good indication.
The second thing is after cleaning the dipstick, just put it back in, pull it out again, and obviously just check the level, if the level is correct. So as you can see, the level is perfect on the mark, so that's good.
So what we won't know when you buy a car is how much oil that an engine is using, because if someone's selling a car, you want to make sure the oil level's correct. So you don't always get that as an accurate indicator.
No, it's not accurate.
I top this oil up, I keep it topped up because I know it uses a bit of oil. So I manage the oil usage, and I change the oil fairly frequently to keep it because of this problem. So this vehicle, although it's done 440,000 kilometers, I've managed the wear while I've been driving it because I know I want to build it up and I want to keep it. But I have driven 50-odd thousand kilometers, and I've replaced one serious component, which was the steering rack. But now I'm finding these problems are starting to creep into the car. But I wouldn't know if I was buying a car whether this car is using oil or not, because I'm using that as one measure. But the compression ratio, the compression test will tell us a bit of more of a story. Am I right?
Exactly, that's what I wanted to mention as well. Like you said, by looking at the dipstick, it doesn't actually tell us anything about the condition of the motor. Yeah. But putting it on the dyno really does explain a lot. And as you mentioned now, the vehicle struggles to start. You've got to crank it long before it actually takes. And when the compression is low, that means the rings is most probably buggered as well. When the rings is buggered, that actually creates blow-by and compression at the subassembly of the motor, and that actually pushes the oil through the induction system, through the breather pipes, through the turbo, etc., etc. And that'll obviously cause the motor to use oil, which is...
And you can also have, this has got a bit of an oil leak as well, so you're really trying to establish the story about this motor, knowing that it's got a bit of an oil leak on the rear main oil seal, which is contributing a little bit to the oil usage. Also, the dipstick telling us a story. Now, when a car gets warmer, this car in particular, it actually gets easier to start, so it's less of a problem. But that also tells that sometimes, the cold starting can be more of an issue than hot starting. And we're going to look now when we run the car at blow-by.
Yeah.
We talked about that.
Yes. Okay, so firstly we're going to remove the oil filler cap, which is also a good indication to start off with. Now, the first thing is to have a look inside and actually just take your finger and see. Well, you'll actually see it from the eye. If there's like a milkiness, yellowish mayonnaise color on the inside of the oil filler cap, that's a good indication that the oil has been contaminated, and it's got water inside it. And you'll actually see this cap on the inside going all murky, and as I say, it's almost like a mayonnaise yellow color. Then you know there's obviously an internal problem with the head gasket or water coming into the oil somehow.
So Mark, now starting the cars, we're going to look and actually see the blow-by coming from the pressure inside the engine. And that's actually going to tell us another indication of extra wear on the engine.
Yeah.
So we'll start the car and then you just go ahead and make the test for us.
We can do that. So now we're just going to take the cap off and just see how much blow-by we've got. And there you can see it actually wants to shoot the cap right off, which is very, very, very high excessive blow-by. Just another test you can do is just to keep a piece of white paper over the cap just to see how much oil it's actually spraying out. It's actually not pushing out any oil, but as you can see, it's actually blowing a black mark on the white paper. And that's all compression being bypassed through into the tapper cover and causing excessive breathing. Okay, turn off.
So we're actually looking for this engine to tell us a whole lot of information from the computer's ECU, from what you're observing, to give us a more informed decision on what we actually do to this vehicle, or do we buy the vehicle or don't we buy the vehicle. So in this instance, take us through what else you're going to look for and how this process is going to move forward.
Yeah, definitely. Beside all the electronics we've got hooked up while doing the dyno and loading it and loading it, we can obviously also do a visual inspection while running it and loading it. If it's full throttle, half throttle, doesn't really matter. First thing is first, on a diesel engine, look if it's smoking. That's your first indication to see if there's anything, bad, if it's engine related or injector. Smoking is not good on a diesel vehicle. So that's the first thing. The other thing is just to listen. Just with letting the motor run, you can actually hear if there's something not nice with the motor. So beside all the electronics and the air-fuel ratios and all that, there's actual visual inspections one can do while running the car on the dyno, which is also a good indication where to start looking, or to know if, like you said, if it's a good car to buy or if there's any issues with it.
And when driving the car and test driving the car, you can also look in the rearview mirror. When you put the foot down, you accelerate hard, look to see if there's actually smoke out the back, and also color of smoke will also give you some indication as well, won't it?
Definitely, yeah. When a diesel vehicle gives a white smoke, there's actually one or two things that it can be. It can be not the engine combusting the fuel correctly, which will cause white smoke. And on top of that, it can also be a timing issue where the diesel is actually combusted on the incorrect time. Right. And that'll also cause a white smoke. It can even be air going through the system, which will also cause white smoke. So there's a few things, but it gives you indication as to where to start looking for the problem when obviously having the white smoke on startup, when driving. Very good indication to see what the issue is.
And if you got black smoke, what would that show you more?
Well, black smoke is usually a lack of air over the diesel that's being sprayed into the combustion. Again, air-fuel ratio is air over fuel. So the less air with the same amount of fuel going in will cause a black smoke because there's a lack of air.
So like a dirty air filter that's not changed is very indicative of your car struggling to breathe. I always say to people, imagine you've got this dirty mask on your face and you're trying to breathe through it.
That's a very good example. Yeah. That's exactly what it's showing us. It can also be a lack of boost at that current point where it's smoking. So it's always good to have a look at that as well. But yeah, in general, dirty mass airflow sensor that actually reads the air coming into the motor, if that's dirty, it can also cause excessive smoking. So also a few stuff to have a look at, obviously.
And then you get more like a blue smoke, which is more of an oil burn on an engine.
Correct, yeah.
You know, which is, so I guess these are real indicators of there is something to look for, and it's important to understand the parameters of what you're looking at so you can really start making a clear decision on what you're doing with the vehicle. And when you take it to someone who can actually diagnose this for you, you're going to feel more confident that the decision you're making is going to be based on what work I have to do and what's the condition of the vehicle, the engine, the fuel system. So we've just done the dyno test. I'm not sure who's buying lunch, possibly me, someone else. But Mark, explain what you found.
Okay, so firstly, the bottom line, which is the darker line, was the second run, and the light one at the top was the first run. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as when I put the car on the dyno, I never do just one run and it's finished. I always do 1 or 2 or 3 runs consecutively right after each other, exactly for the reason that what we're seeing here. As you can see, the first run it made 81 kilowatt and 280 newton meters of torque, and I did a run immediately after that and it dropped down quite significantly down to 78 kilowatt and 267 newtons. Now, besides that it's smoking quite a lot, this is just an indication that there's a real problem with this vehicle and the actual engine, because for power output to drop that by this much is not a good indication at all. At all. This means that besides the compression, everything is low, the injector system is probably due for recon. So this is a very good indication that there's a serious problem with this motor vehicle, with the engine itself.
And I guess this is one of the reasons we're going to pull this motor apart, because we're seeing problems, and then once we open it up we can uncover what are those problems, what did this show us, and how does it all correlate to the picture. And all these pieces are puzzle pieces coming in together, and I guess what we're trying to establish is the picture that we need. Now this would be a clear indication if you're going to look at a car like this and buy it. You're either buying it because you know the body and chassis is in really good condition, knowing you're going to spend the money on redoing the motor, which is fine. But at least you have that understanding and expectation on what you're going to find when you open it up and you've got to do all the work.
Yeah.
So anything else that you would tell from here, anything else you'd do in this, besides the compression test we haven't done yet, but you're already picking up problems?
Yeah, no, definitely. If you go look at the dyno graph itself, and you go read up on specifications, it needs to make a certain power on a certain RPM. So in this case, with a KZT 3 liter, it needs to make its peak kilowatt power on 3600, which it's doing. It's making its peak power on it's a bit lower there, but I mean, it's within the region where it needs to be at. So I'm happy with where the power is making it, but what's concerning is where the newton meters of torque is. On a diesel vehicle, you're purely relying on the low down newton meters that you want for 4x4ing, for towing heavy trailers and whatever you need Overland to do, vehicle. You need the low down torque. That's why you want a diesel vehicle. And we're seeing here that the peak torque is sitting on 2,500 RPMs. It needs to be on 2,000. So that's another indication to show us, is the turbo faulty? Is there a boost pressure leak? Is the turbo spooling when it needs to spool? Because it needs to be on specification, especially on the torque, because that's what you're relying on when it gets to a vehicle in diesel. And obviously that will give you your consumption as well. If the power isn't where it needs to be, you need to drive it harder. If you drive it harder, the fuel consumption becomes, much worse.
Yeah, and you're also putting more heat through the engine.
Exactly.
So really what you're saying also is when you're going to look at rebuilding an engine, It doesn't help to just do one half of the job. If the fuel injection system isn't done, if the turbo is not done, if the pipes aren't renewed, you're actually looking at the full parameters of everything and saying, to do the job properly, to understand where the problems are, once we pull it all apart, we'll probably get more telltales and more information. But I think the key thing is that it doesn't help to do the engine up and then find you've lost some of the power just because you haven't done something like the turbo or you haven't, replaced some of the pipes.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's pointless doing the whole rebuild, and the most important opponents or components that makes the motor work isn't right.
Yeah.
I mean, a turbo must be working 100% correct. The fuel injector must be working 100% correct. The diesel pump must supply the correct diesel fuel. It must be set on the correct timing. If that stuff isn't all working together, then it's pointless having a brand new motor and all that external stuff hasn't been done. Then you're actually wasting your time. Where if everything is done and you've got a package that works together, then you'll find that it will be a different car.
And that's the value of coming back and putting it after we've rebuilt the engine, and that's what we're going to do. We're actually going to bring the vehicle back after everything's been done and retest it and recalibrate and relook at everything so we can set it up properly and then check how the power and performance looks.
Yeah, and the nice thing is we can actually plot it onto this graph and we
Yes.
can actually see the difference between what it's now and what it's going to be afterwards. And that's obviously a nice indication, especially for people that don't understand what it actually means to rebuild and recondition a motor or the external components. It will be a very, very nice indication, and just to see what the actual difference is on it.
Well, we've done the dyno and we've got the results. The power is not what it should be, and we kind of expected that with the compressions. But I've decided anyway that this is a vehicle I'm keeping. We're going to take it back to Snyman 4x4. We're going to pull the engine, strip it slowly so we can actually see what parts need to be changed. What are we going to replace? The whole engine assembly will come back down, that's the head, the block and the sump, back down to Goch Cooper. They will then strip it further, make a more detailed diagnosis of what's wrong with the engine before we decide to do the repairs and rebuild the engine back to its full power and strength. So thanks again for all your support and all the comments. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, hit that bell notification, and for more information, go to our website.